a network analysis of Mali's northern conflict. Professor Walther is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Center for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark, and he's also a visiting professor at the Division of Global Affairs. He holds a PhD in geography from the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. As a geographer, he's primarily interested in understanding how borders affect social networks. In Western Europe, his research interest lies in a comparative study of cross-border policy networks and cross-border labor markets in metropolitan regions. In West Africa, he studies cross-border trade and border markets, cross-border cooperation, and the spatial patterns of transnational terrorist organizations. Over the last years, Dr. Walther has consulted for the West Africa Club at the OECD, the World Bank, and the United Nations. His research has been funded by the National Research Fund of Luxembourg, the European Spatial Planning Observatory, the European Commission, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. His work combines geographic information systems, social network analysis, statistical analysis, and qualitative interviews. He has traveled and conducted extensive surveys to diverse locations like Luxembourg, France, Germany, and Switzerland in Western Europe, and to Nigeria, Mali, Mauritania, and Ghana in West Africa. Dr. Walther is the Africa editor of the journal Borderlands Studies from Rutgers. So please join me in welcoming Professor Walther.
Thank you very much again for this very nice introduction. It's always a pleasure to be in Newark. Some of you might know that a couple of years back I was teaching African Studies at the Division of Global Affairs, and I'm always happy to come back and speak about my research. Today I have a paper on the current situation in northern Mali and the structure between the different actors in conflict. The presentation is actually based on a recent paper which I'm sure you will find easily online. It's a policy paper, which means that it's very short. Policymakers don't actually like to read too much, but what I did for today was to produce a longer version of the paper in which I try also to explain the political situation of the entire region in West Africa, and perhaps introduce some social network analysis which you will not find online in this paper, but which are also interesting to discuss with you. So, some of you might know that over the last years, the political situation in Mali has been increasingly difficult, and the country has experienced a long period of political instability. As you can see from the slide, there are different types of actors, the Malian government, of course, the French forces which have intervened, a couple of rebels groups which try to seek independence from Mali, and lots of terrorist groups trying to destabilize the region. So, just a few words about the evolution of the conflict. You might know that in 2012, a couple of rebels, secessionist rebels, joined forces with Islamist groups from Nigeria, and they took over the northern part of Mali, which is known as Azawad. It's the green part which you can see on the map. It's actually quite big. It's as large as the state of Texas in the US. So it's a big piece of land which was actually conquered in a few weeks. And in 2013, the French decided to intervene in Mali, and again in a few weeks they were very successful, and they defeated most of the forces which were located in Mali. Some of the Islamist groups fled to Algeria, Libya, other countries. Some remained, and the political situation is still quite difficult at the moment. You might have heard that the country is facing some terrorist attacks, and it's difficult to see the end of the conflict, actually. So what I would like to do in this paper is to discuss how Mali can actually be a typical example of what is known in the literature as a kind of new war. You might be familiar with the concept developed by Mary Kandler. in this very influential book. New wars are new forms of conflict in which you have lots of non-state actors with very different agendas, and the relationship between those actors are also very difficult to understand because they shift all the time. Another very important aspect of such new wars is that they're not primarily based on control on land, but they are mostly interested in controlling people and excluding some people from some areas. So in most of those conflicts, violence is directed against civilians. And civilian victims are not just the consequence of the conflict, but an objective of himself. Another very important aspect of the new wars is the fact that they are usually not limited to one country. They spread across borders, and that's one of the things I'm particularly interested in. I want to understand how those people actually cross border. It's a very large region, but people are also very mobile. And one day they would be in Mauritania, the other day in Algeria, and the next day in Mali. So it's important to actually understand how they use space and how they can move well, with facility across countries. In many of those conflicts, we have connections between fighters, secessionist movements, and criminals, because in many cases, both are actually benefiting from weak states and the possibility to establish transnational networks, trafficking networks across the region. As a consequence, as you can imagine, this is a situation in which the conflicts are very difficult to resolve, and it's hard to see the end of the Malian conflict today. I'm just going to say a few words about the general situation in West Africa and how political instability has evolved over the last 50 years. So on the slide you can see that the region has actually experienced different cycles of violence. If you look at the 1960s, for example, you have interstate conflict, but it's more stable than today. If you look at the 70s and 90s, again you have interstate conflict between Libya and Chad, or Morocco, Mauritania. So it's a very different type of conflict. If you look at the more recent period, well, that's the beginning of perhaps those kind of new wars in which you have a very dangerous combination of rebels, terrorist groups, and all kinds of non-state actors that interact within countries, in Algeria, for example, or more recently, across countries. And it's been very, very difficult to understand actually how these people interact. We know that they are well connected, but we don't actually know how. So what I'm going to do in the paper is to try to understand the structure of those relationships, and I'm using social network analysis, which is a quantitative approach to social structure. This is another series of maps which show that actually as a consequence of the increasing political instability in the region, many regions, many countries have become almost no-go areas. These maps are made by the French Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and the red parts of the map indicates areas that are formally advised not to travel to. The orange parts where you should not travel unless absolutely necessary. As you can see, there's an evolution between 2011 to 2013. An increasing number of regions are today very dangerous. Between 2013 and 2016, there seems to be a number of changes, but the overall situation hasn't changed much. So how do we actually understand this evolution? How do we understand the strategies developed by the actors within those countries and region. One of the things that the map cannot show is actually that some areas can be very dangerous, but some can be also very peaceful. So it's difficult to understand exactly where is violence concentrated. So what we have done is to try to locate violent events, and we use a very large open source dataset, which is known as ACLED. You'll find it online. You can download files for any countries. And we have actually located every violent event since 1997. That gives you an idea of actually the concentration of political violence in the region. And perhaps you can already see that the Sahel-Sahara region, which is this big piece of West Africa, is actually less affected than other regions. But still, political violence is concentrated, especially in Nigeria, not just northern Nigeria, Boko Haram, etc., but also southern Nigeria. It's a very dangerous area. Algeria is another hotbed of violence. Libya, as you know, and finally the Gulf of Guinea. What I'm going to do today is to look at the region between these major hotbeds of violence, if I can find them. Yes. So I'm going to look at this region here, from Mauritania to Chad, where we have less violence in terms of the number of victims, but we have very interesting political relationships between actors in conflict. If we look at the historical evolution of those fatalities, well, there's something very interesting there. This graph shows fatalities related to violent and radical groups. And as you can see, there's an evolution from 1997 to 2014 in the sense that an increasing number of victims are related to radical groups. In that region, radical groups are related to Islamist movements. Back in the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, well, the situation was very different in the sense that you had a combination between rebels and secessionist movements in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria. But over time, you can see that the number of victims related to radical groups is increasing a lot. And today they represent a very high proportion of fatalities in the region. So that's one of the major aspects of West African countries. If you try to map those fatalities and terrorist attacks in the region since the mid-2000s, you have a very interesting map. Again, we use the same kind of data, but we only use events related to a number of groups, which you can see there. Of course, they are somehow related to Al-Qaeda, but they have different names. It's very often difficult to know exactly who is doing what. But what you can see from the map is that you have two very different strategies. The first strategy is related to all the Al-Qaeda related groups, which originally came from Algeria and crossed Algeria and reached Mali, and then they spread from Mali in the neighboring countries. This is a very particular strategy in the sense that you have long-distance movements between groups, which is different from the strategy developed by Boko Haram in Nigeria, in the sense that you have events that are very localized and very near to each other. So in one case, you have a situation where groups seems to be extremely mobile across the region, and on the other hand, you have a situation where you have a very localized and perhaps national conflict related to one particular group. What I'm going to do in the paper is to look at positive and negative relationships between actors in conflict in Mali, and I define alliances as agreements or joint political events or military operations between organizations. I also define conflicts as avoidance or hatred or political violence between those groups. And I look at 15 organizations in the country, and they all belong to one of the three groups, which you can see there: government and all the militias that work with the government, the rebels that are divided in lots and lots of groups, and finally radical groups. What I do is I go through the literature and I identify each of those groups. And every time I have a new name, I list it in an Excel table like this. So you have a list of organizations. And then I look whether this group is in conflict or allied to all the other groups. So this produces a very large matrix, 15 by 15 matrix, in which I know exactly who is working with whom, who is against whom. And I'm using that to produce what is known as a sociogram, which is the representation of a social network. This network can be composed of positive ties, meaning groups working together. And in that case, having lots of friends is very important. In a friendship network or in a network composed of allies, the more connections you are, the more important you are, because you can rely on different allies to conduct your operations. In positive tie networks, such as this one, transitivity is also very important. It means that, transitivity means that if the French and the Malians are allied, and Mali and the UN are allied, I can also suppose that the French and the UN will be friends, right? This is transitivity. It works fine with the positive tie network. But if you look at the negative tie network, it doesn't work anymore. If Al-Qaeda in the Islamist Maghreb is in conflict with Algeria, and Algeria is in conflict with another group, Al-Qaeda and this group will not be in conflict. They will be friends. Because enemies of enemies are friends, right? So you can't actually look at networks of friends or networks of enemies with the same kind of analytical tools. You have to develop different tools for each network. The second main difference is that in a network of friends, it's important to have more friends. But in the network of enemies, it's important to have few enemies. And central actors, those that have lots of ties, also have more constraints. It's the complete opposite of being surrounded by people you like, obviously. So I'm going to apply those concepts to the situation in Mali. And this is what I get when I map the connections between enemies in Mali. This is known as a sociogram, in the sense that the distance between actors is a social distance. If they are close, they have more conflicts. Well, we can see that it's quite a dense network, in the sense that there are lots of enemies in the region. It's not just dyads or triads of actors. It's a whole set of actors in conflicts. We can distinguish, of course, between the government, the rebels, and the Islamist groups. And we can observe that Islamist groups have fewer enemies than rebels, which should indicate that they have more autonomy from a structural perspective. Rebels are also tied to actors that have many enemies. If you have lots of enemies yourself, it's obviously quite bad. If you have, if some of those enemies also have enemies, it is going to change your structural position. I'm going to go back to that aspect later. So if you want to understand the structural position of a group, you have to look at the ties between this group and its neighbor, but you also have to look beyond that, how the enemies of enemies are connected, because this is going to have a strong impact on your own autonomy as a player in the region. If I look at the network of allies now, it's a complete different picture. Instead of a very dense network of enemies, I have pieces, small coalitions. The first one being between the government, the UN, and the militia. But as you can see, the government is very isolated in the sense that it is unable to connect to other groups. It has too few friends, in a sense. Rebels, indicated in yellow, are also divided. They have not been able to form a large coalition. Finally, Islamist groups are, perhaps the best connected in that region. They have lots of friends within the larger group of Islamist groups. They form a strong cluster. So now you can understand why the situation has been so complicated and why peace agreement is very difficult to reach. When you have people that cannot form a large, I should say organizations that are unable to form large coalitions, where it's very difficult to reach consensus. And you have too many agendas at the same time. So now I'm going to explain what it means in terms of power, and why the situation keeps becoming worse and worse. At the moment, we have a triad of three major actors: the government, rebels, and Islamists. As you can see from this picture, they have developed negative relationships between each other. And this is a very unstable triad. There are two situations in which triads can be stable. A triad is a group of three. The first situation is when you have two negative and one positive ties. So these two, for example, agree that they don't like this one. And the second situation is where you obviously have only positive ties. Everybody's going along with everybody. If you have that situation in which you have only negative ties between organizations, this is going to produce instability, and this is going to lead actors to seek for other forms of relationships. For example, by creating a new positive tie. And you would go back to the initial situation, which is more stable. So we can actually understand the evolution of conflicts by looking at combined positive and negative ties. Because ultimately, the autonomy of actors will be dependent on their friends and enemies. In the case of Mali, no one is actually capable of creating a large coalition, as I said, and as long as power relations remain the same as in this, on this graph, the violence will start again. It's impossible to reach a common ground. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about power, because the way you are connected usually tells a lot about how powerful you are. In the general sense, if you look at the international relations literature, for example, it is assumed that some people or some countries or some organizations are powerful, in the sense that power is something that they have as an attribute. I'm sure you know those kind of maps in which you have the balance of power in certain regions, and you have a number of tanks and soldiers on each side. When we look at the structure of actors in conflicts, we look at power defined in a very different way. We look at power defined as a structural position, depending on the number of friends and enemies that each of the players have. In a general sense, being connected to an ally who is free of threats reduces autonomy. I'm going to show you why. And most actors should try to develop a diversified network of allies. And this is the best situation, which is going to provide you more autonomy. I think I have a slide on this one, yes. But before that, I'd like to ask you, who do you think is powerful on the slide? In the first situation, the star network, this one. Who do you think is powerful?
Netherlands.
Sorry?
Which is in the middle, like.
Yes, correct. What about the second situation in which you have like a butterfly network?
X.
Yes, correct. X is able to bridge two separate clusters within the network. And in the final situation, well, again, it's better to be connected to two people at the same time rather than to be at the very periphery of a large chain of people. So actually powers depend very much on your own situation, yes?
But in this case, X, that maybe group or something, it's more exposed to risk as well, because it's connected to other groups which they can anytime attack.
Correct.
So if that group has power, but at the same time it's more exposed to risk.
Yes, that means that we should look at the strength of ties, but also the kind of ties developed by actors. Correct. This is the same situation. In the first graph, well, this is a star network in which being connected to lots of other people gives you power. In the second situation in which you introduce more actors, then it's also good to be very in the center of the network. But if you have that kind of situation in which, well, I should have modified the structure. But if everybody is connected to everybody, then power tends to disappear. Power is very much related to the structural position and the difference in the number of ties that people have. So if everybody has the same number of ties, the difference in terms of power tends to be reduced. Let me just give you an example before we move to the situation in Mali. Let's say that we have two actors in conflict, A and B, and I introduce a third actor, which is allied to B. Now we have a triad, a stable triad of two negative ties and one positive tie. A will tend to look for an ally himself, so actor A will tend to create a new tie to D, to try to escape from the situation. And D can also have a multiple number of relationships to another ally. So my point is that if you are actor A, you'd better not be connected to an ally which has lots of friends. Because in that situation, power is probably going to be higher for D than it is for A. Let me come back to my initial assumption, which was that being connected to an ally who is himself free of threat reduces autonomy. In that situation, the autonomy of A is reduced by the fact that D has lots of friends. And you can actually apply this principle to existing situations in the world. If you look at North Korea and South Korea, obviously they are in conflict. North Korea is connected to China, that's a major ally. But South Korea has lots of friends, is obviously connected to the US, and the US also has lots of friends. In that situation, you can very well understand that the structural autonomy of the US is much larger than the one in South Korea. So I'm going to apply that kind of principle to the situation in Mali. And the first general principle that we can draw from the analysis of the northern Mali conflict is that any alliance or conflict is possible in the region. Probably the best example is that the first movement which you can see, the first picture you can see on the slide, taken from a fighter from the national movement from the liberation of Azawad. Well, this movement joined forces with a number of other Islamist groups in 2012. But their objectives were very different. For the MNLA, the objective was to create a new state in Mali. Most Islamist groups on the other side were actually against independence. All they wanted was the implementation of Sharia, which is the religious law, and they were not actually interested in having their own state. So in that situation, we have a very good example of an alliance between groups that have very different agendas. And this can be repeated over and over if you look at the history of Mali. Any alliance or conflict is possible. If you look at the evolution of certain people like this very prominent leader, Iyad al-Ghali, you can see that he has been almost everything in his career. He's been a fighter for Gaddafi, he's been a rebel, he's been working for the government, he tried to take the lead of the secessionist movement, and finally he founded an Islamist group in 2012. So it's very difficult to track the evolution of those individuals and also the organization, sorry, need some water, organizations that they represent in some way. Another example is that groups tend to change name all the time. They tend to merge and split according to local circumstances, and it's particularly the case of all the groups loosely affiliated to Al-Qaeda. This is a simplified evolution of Al-Qaeda affiliated groups from 1992, and you can see how they tend to evolve, but it's always the same kind of people, right? They have different names, and they can always work together or be in conflict with each other depending on local opportunities. So my point is that to understand the situation in Mali, you have to look at the possible alliances or conflict between groups and how they evolve over time. The man pictured on the slide is Mokhtar, but Mokhtar is one of the leaders of Al-Qaeda in the Islamist Maghreb, and he's been very good at creating new groups, splitting, merging over time, and he's always there, always doing the same thing under different names. The second general principle that we can draw based on the analysis of the structural relationship between actors is that conflicts reflect social or regional fault lines in West Africa. Local societies are very much divided into segments, and perhaps some of you know this very famous saying, I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, and I and my brothers and my cousins against the world. It means that it's impossible to unite at a higher level, at the national or at the supranational level, and those groups are always divided in some way which is unpredictable. They are also today increasingly divided between those who have become extremely rich due to drug trafficking and those who actually suffer from the political situation and Tuareg or Arab societies in West Africa suffer very much from those inequalities today. I guess the third principle is that you have no sustainable alliances between groups. What you see is temporary agreements according to circumstances among local actors. Sometimes you have alliances forged because they want to develop a new drug trafficking network, but they can also dissolve when a common enemy disappears. When the French invaded, responded to Mali's request to defend the north of the country, for example, many people from Islamist groups joined other groups, including secessionist groups. So very often we have this very flexible and fluid situation in which people move from one group to the other, and they are very difficult to track. So my last slide will be about the evolution of the conflict. How can we imagine the future of this country and the evolution of the political situation? In other words, which way north? But as you know, this is not a viable option in the sense that it creates identity-based apartheid, it creates groups that are, countries that are not necessarily viable and which are always a source of tension. The second option would be to use local tribes to actually rule the north of the country. It's been done for a long time by the French in the during colonial times. It's been done also over the last decades, but it usually doesn't work because you still have ungoverned peripheries, and the state is unable to project its power in these areas. So I guess the only way north would be to actually combine regional development and state legitimacy. In other words, providing local societies with infrastructure, local government, but at the same time help the state project its power beyond the capital city. That's one of the options I see for the moment, and I think I'm at the end of my presentation. This is just a list of papers. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.